A dying Apache woman's gratitude turned into a life-changing offer. Want to know what she gave in return? Stay tuned, like this video, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Let's get started. The Arizona sun blazed down with a punishing heat that seemed to strip the land of life. Dust swirled lazily with the desert wind, carrying with it the faint scent of dry mesquite and scorched earth. I'd just finished trading at the small outpost, my saddlebag filled with supplies, when something unusual caught my eye. At first I thought it was a mirage shimmering against the dunes, but then the figure stumbled and fell. I urged my horse closer, and to my shock, I saw a woman, worn, wounded, her body barely clinging to strength, collapsed at my horse's hooves. She looked as though she had walked through fire and storm to reach this place. Her dark hair, tangled with sand, clung to her sweat-streaked face. Her dress, once beautifully hand-sewn, was torn and dirty, as though she had fought her way through thorns and enemies alike. Her lips were dry and cracked, eyes sunken but still burning with the desperate spark of survival. I leaned down and lifted her gently, her body as light as a bird in my arms, and placed her across the saddle. She did not resist. She simply closed her eyes, trusting me with the little strength she had left. The nearest water source was a shallow spring I knew of, just beyond the ridge. I spurred my horse onward, dust rising behind us as we cut through the desert. By the time we reached the spring, she was barely conscious. Kneeling beside her, I filled my canteen and held it to her lips. At first, she hesitated, her eyes flickering with suspicion. But thirst won over fear, and she drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. She coughed, then steadied, and I could see the faintest color returning to her face. Still, even in that fragile moment, there was something wild and guarded about her. As she regained her breath, she whispered in broken English, her voice hoarse but urgent. Her words came slowly, as though every syllable cost her effort. She told me she had escaped men who hunted her, enemies who wanted her gone. The details were scattered, but from what I understood, she had run for days without food or water. The desert was merciless, but she had chosen to face it rather than fall into their hands. I sat silently, listening, understanding that her story carried more pain than she could reveal in that moment. Survival was all that mattered now. I wrapped her in a blanket from my saddlebag and helped her onto my horse once more. The ride back to my cabin was quiet, the only sound the creak of leather and the rhythmic beat of hooves against the dry earth. Every so often I felt her head rest lightly against my back, her breathing shallow but steady. She was trusting me with her life, a stranger whose face she had only just seen. And I, in turn, felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy on my shoulders. This woman needed more than water. She needed safety. My cabin was modest, a wooden structure tucked between the rocks and the sparse mesquite trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shield her from the desert's cruelty. I carried her inside and laid her on my bed, covering her with another blanket. For days that followed, I cared for her as best I could. I prepared broth, offered water, and tended to her wounds with the limited supplies I had. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was only a word or two in English. But her eyes watched me closely, always measuring, always questioning. There were moments when I caught her staring at me, her gaze sharp and searching. It was as though she was trying to decide if my kindness was genuine or if I, too, would betray her trust. I never pressed her for details of her past or the danger she had fled. I knew that when she was ready, she would tell me. Instead, I focused on small gestures, leaving food by her side, offering her warmth, making sure she knew she was safe. Slowly, her shoulders eased, and her breathing grew less troubled in the quiet nights. The desert outside raged on as usual, windstorms howling, coyotes crying in the distance, but inside my cabin there was a fragile peace. On the third evening, as the sun bled red and gold across the horizon, I found her sitting up for the first time. She had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her hair falling in loose waves over her face. When she looked at me, her expression was different. The suspicion had softened, replaced by something deeper, an unspoken gratitude, maybe even a kind of wonder. She held my gaze longer than before, and I felt the weight of her silence. That night, as the desert wind whistled through the cracks in the wood, I sat by the fire, carving a piece of wood to pass the time. She was beside me, closer than ever before. For the first time, she reached out her hand and placed it gently over mine. Her touch was warm, steady, and deliberate. I turned to her, startled, and found her eyes shining with an intensity I had not seen before. Her lips trembled slightly as she spoke, her voice carrying both vulnerability and resolve. "You helped me when no one else would. I want to give you something greater in return." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I did not yet know what she intended, but I understood that it was not said lightly. This was more than thanks. It was a promise, perhaps even a bridge between two lives that had collided under the merciless sun of the Arizona desert. Whatever she meant, I could sense that the days ahead would hold more than just survival. Something was changing, something unexpected and powerful, and it had begun the moment I stopped to help the woman lying alone in the sand. I stared at her, stunned by the weight of her words. My mind wrestled with what she had just said. Marriage was not something I had been seeking, not in this land of dust and silence, where survival itself often felt like a full-time burden. Yet the way she spoke, firm, unwavering, made it clear that this was no casual suggestion. It was a declaration of trust, of honor, something far deeper than mere gratitude. The firelight flickered across her face, and I could see both her determination and the vulnerability she hid carefully behind her words. In that moment, I wanted to answer, but I found myself speechless. What could I say? To accept meant taking a step into a world that was not mine, bridging two cultures that often looked at each other with suspicion. To refuse might insult her and, worse, diminish the bond we had begun to build. My heart raced, and I could only nod slowly, letting silence carry the weight of my thoughts. She seemed to understand, and without pressing further, she simply gave me a look that said, "Wait, you will see." Days passed quietly after that night. The woman, stronger now, moved with a sense of purpose. She helped with small tasks around my cabin, gathering water, mending cloth, preparing food when I returned from tending my horse or checking the traps. There was a quiet dignity in everything she did. She spoke little, but her eyes spoke volumes, and sometimes, when I caught her gaze, I felt as though she was measuring me still, not as the man who had rescued her, but as the man who might one day share her daughter's future. True to her word, a week later, she returned, not alone this time. Riding beside her was a young woman, tall and poised, her dark hair flowing freely in the desert wind. She carried herself with the same fierce spirit I had seen in her mother, but her face was softened by a gentle kindness that struck me immediately. When they dismounted, her mother introduced us with pride. The young woman bowed her head respectfully, her eyes meeting mine only for a moment, before drifting away, modest but unafraid. I studied her quietly, feeling a strange mix of awe and nervousness. She was not a fragile soul in need of rescue. No, she stood rooted in her own strength, like the desert mesquite that survived through fire and drought. Her hands bore the marks of work, her frame lean but steady, her expression calm yet sharp. She was someone who could endure the hardships of this land, someone who could stand beside a man and not behind him. And in that moment I realized her mother had not been exaggerating when she said, "Perfect for you." The three of us shared a simple meal that evening. Conversation was minimal, bridged by gestures and quiet exchanges. The daughter spoke more in her native tongue, with her mother translating when needed. I felt like a guest in my own home, caught between unfamiliar words and traditions, but instead of discomfort, I felt a deep respect. They were opening their lives to me, offering me something sacred. I could sense the seriousness of their proposal, This was not arranged from convenience or gain. It was born of honor, gratitude, and a recognition of shared spirit. As the night deepened, I found myself walking outside, staring at the endless sky spattered with stars. My heart was unsettled, yet not with fear. The thought of marriage had never occupied my mind before, yet here it was, as clear as the moonlight above me. A bridge between two people, two families, two worlds. The desert, so often a place of loneliness, now offered me the possibility of companionship, of building something lasting. For the first time in years, I felt not just alive, but called to something greater than myself. Over the following days, the young woman and her mother visited often. She and I began to speak in fragments, my broken attempts at her language, her halting English, piecing together a fragile but growing connection. We laughed at mistakes, shared stories in half-understood sentences, and worked side by side in silence when words failed. And with each day, I saw her more clearly, not just her strength and loyalty, but the warmth that glowed in her smile, the patience in her spirit, the gentleness she extended to even the smallest things. I began to understand what her mother had seen in me, why she had spoken those words with such certainty. It was not merely about gratitude, it was about balance. I had saved her life, but in return, she was offering me a life worth living, one filled with meaning and shared purpose. When I looked at her daughter, I no longer saw just the stranger brought to my door. I saw the possibility of family, of a future rooted in respect, built on the foundation of two worlds meeting under the vast American skies. One evening, as the desert wind whispered outside once more, her mother placed my hand in her daughter's. No words were spoken, none were needed. The bond was clear, the promise already made. I looked into the young woman's eyes, and for the first time she did not look away. Instead, she smiled, soft yet steady, and in that smile I found the answer to the confusion I had carried. What had begun as a simple act of kindness in the desert had led me here, to a love unspoken, a respect unshakable, and a new beginning neither of us had expected.